we saw our church not just double by two churches coming together. We've seen our church triple and even more because of the story of what God was doing.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Upper Left podcast. We're really excited to be together today with some really awesome people to talk about a topic that's not that common. It's a very interesting story, something that you probably would never predict. And we get to unpack it today. So welcome, everybody. My name is Gabe Kolstad. I'm from Westside Community Church in Beaverton, Oregon. And I'm here with my buddy, Ahshuwah Hawthorne from Brilliance Labs. How you doing, Ahshuwah?
What's up, Gabe? It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. Hey, we'd love to take a second to get to know our guest, Stephen Ryan. So guys, would you just take a minute to kind of get us familiarized with you and share a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. My name's Ryan Moffat. Born and raised kind of east side Portland, Gresham area. Did my undergrad over in Multnomah and got to get my degree at Western Seminary, my master's there. So pastored over at Good Shepherd Community Church for a handful of years, and been over in Sisters for the last 14 years. My claim to fame is my amazing wife, Michelle, and we have 4 children. So it's awesome. A joy to be a part of what you guys are doing today. Thanks for inviting us in.
Thank you. Just curious, how old are your kids?
Yeah. Oldest is almost 20. So 20, 18, 13, and 11.
Nice.
And got one at Moody Bible Institute, and she's thriving. And then my next is getting ready to head towards Grand Canyon University. So it's amazing. Yeah.
Fantastic. And expensive.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah. Well, my name's Steve Stratos. I grew up on the East Coast, didn't grow up in a Christian home. Actually became a believer after living in a teepee for 4 years up and down the Pecos Wilderness. I was one of those hippies that came to Christ in 1973. So I'm older than all you guys. And I went back to the East Coast, went to a non-accredited Bible school, and planted my first church in my hometown. That was Springfield, Massachusetts. And it was pretty significant work. Had about 800 folks. We had a K through 12 school. We started being crazy for missions. We had a number of people in the mission field. We bought a big piece of land and built a camp, had an inner city campus. So all the good stuff. And then after about 14 years, had a moral failure and left the ministry. Mm-hmm. And so that obviously was a heartache for me and my family, and left there thinking I would never go back into ministry again. Ended up in Virginia with a friend that I had met actually in Israel. Little long story, but I'll give you some history of it today. And so it was, I ended up at Liberty and did my MDiv at Liberty through the encouragement of these guys, because they said, you love learning, keep going, and were encouraging. Met Ron Hawkins, who from Liberty, he was the dean at the seminary there, became the president at Western Seminary. And when he came to Portland, he asked me to come with him to recruit students and to do my D-Min. So I worked for Western for a few years, did my doctorate of ministry, and then from there worked at Hinson Church back right after, way back Ron Baker days, and then Don Baker days, and then a couple of things. Bruce Boria was the pastor then, was there for 5-6 years. Bruce left. I was a little bit interim for a while. And then they got a new guy, and I started to do some work in the business world and use my doctorate to do some help with churches that were struggling. I did my D-Min in natural church development, and it became a vehicle and because of Western Seminary, churches would call and I would have an opportunity to go be interim pastor, help them in ways. which I did for a number of years. Worked at Mosaic Church for a little while.
Oh, wow.
And then did some interim movements along the way, 6 or 7 before I came here. It was about 7 years where I taught coaching at Western Seminary in their coaching curriculum. And during that time was doing work at different churches, which when I came to Sisters, and we'll tell the rest of the story, it was very similar to a lot of the other churches that I had been to help get them at least stable before they hired the next guy, because churches often panic and try to hire the next guy, and they just bring him into their dysfunction and they all blow up together. So, so that's how I ended up in Sisters.
Man, this is loaded. I can't wait to learn from you guys today. So, yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. So I'm also excited. And I heard a little bit of this story over the years and then observed some of these things happening from afar. Ryan, can you remind me? I was trying to think through when we first met, because we've kind of followed some of the same path, right? Multnomah and Western Seminary. Did we first connect through Jonathan? Or was there something else?
Yeah, I think I think I knew of you, but I think I actually sat and talked with you one of Jonathan Martin's servant leadership weekend cohorts. And so I think that's where we first met. And I think Jonathan's, leadership paradigm for a lot of us young leaders that have seen maybe the pastor as celebrity, or the pastor as the CEO, or the pastor as the visionary. We've kind of seen the failures of that, but have not had a place to we've done the deconstruction, we haven't reconstructed. So I think Jonathan's, for a lot of us that have been through some church pain, he's provided a really beautiful place for us to process some of that. And then with the Bible open, start reconstructing a biblical framework for leadership in the church. So I think that's where we actually got to dive in with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners, we're talking about Jonathan Martin. He serves with CoServe. We actually did a podcast with him last year on servant leadership. And he even referenced this story here, because I know he serves with you guys in Sisters. So here's how I'm thinking we do the conversation. Let's go back in time and let's tell the two parallel stories of these two churches. And then we'll zoom forward in time and hear how the stories ended, at least, or that chapter ended and a new chapter has begun. Okay, so Ryan, tell us a little bit of the origin story of Vast Church, of God calling you to start that church, and just what that early journey was like.
Okay, so this is my big disclaimer. I'm just one perspective, and this is my perspective. This is how I remember it. I'm sure somebody would correct me and say, that's not really how it happened, but I'm a preacher, so I'm going to embellish. I ended up in Sisters in 2010, came out here really honestly to recover from a decade into youth ministry, just exhausted. I didn't understand emotional intelligence, emotional health. I just was going to burn for Jesus, and I ended up burning out. So I came to Sisters, and I was going to get a degree in Parks and Rec, mind my own business, and be a great small group leader. And I really felt like that was a noble calling, and really believed that's what I was going to do. I was attending Sisters Community Church, and for a year it was a blast. Pastor Tim would preach the Bible, and it was just so healing and refreshing. And I think fondly of that first year being in Sisters. But after that first year, the church in Sisters that I was just enjoying was beginning to have conflict. And what I learned after the fact is that actually the conflict was always there. It's just that it was hidden. There's always a subversive threat, right, in the church. There's always rumblings. There's always things under the surface. And a lot of that began to come out. And what happened is because of the bylaws at Sisters Community Church, SCC, the elders and the pastors were voted out per the bylaws. So they had to have 75% affirmation. I think they got like 73%. There was a lot of issues. There that led to that kind of, what I would just say, really unhealthy behavior. That's not, nowhere in the New Testament do we see that kind of thing of a democratic vote. But we don't need to talk about that. The point is, these churches separated, and this group that voted out went and started a new church. So again, we were just sitting in the back, and we thought, those are our leaders. Those are, the scriptures tell us to obey our leaders and submit to those who are, watching over our souls. So we felt like, our family was going to follow those guys. So we did. And we were there all of about 2 or 3 weeks. And then another bomb dropped, and the pastors that started that ended up all resigning. So we went from a church split to a church plant to a leaderless church plant with no clarity of what was going on in about 60 days. And that's how, so I didn't plant the church. I never would have picked that name. I still don't like that name. I don't even know what it means. This was back when the one word kind of, postmodern, like make people think about how cool we are. I'm like, I'm boring. If I lived in boring, my church would be called Boring Bible Church. I would love it. So, Sisters Bible Church is my good idea. So that's how I ended up with Bass Church. But that's kind of the origin story of how the churches broke apart.
Wow. Now, Steve, where were you at as all this was going on? And from your perspective, what happened and led to this breakup at the church?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say, in my experience with a number of churches, this one being the only one that I stayed on to pastor with Ryan, it's, leadership is such an important thing. And as we've mentioned, even in my first church, when you have leaders who are strong, you can build a church without God and nobody even knows the difference sometimes. So that's an unfortunate, sad indictment at times against the church. But with all my experience with churches, as go the priests, so go the people. So when leaders are not really clear, they don't have, and sometimes it's created, they don't have the kind of humility necessary because they're really good at what they do. And sometimes controlling becomes a part of the issue. And then, congregation members don't respond well. And so all of a sudden you have poor leaderships that are not giving real clarity through a servant heart, and then congregational members who are reacting. So when I came to Sisters, and I would say this, Sisters had within it the DNA of that, because Vast was not the only split that Sisters had experienced. They had lost a pastor before the Vast situation as a result of a failure, and they didn't know what to do with that. And then they had the Vast situation, and that created a split. And then after the Vast split, they had another pastor, and they had another split. Matter of fact, they videotaped that split. They called it Black Sunday. It was horrific to watch. I got a call after that and said, hey, this is what's going on. I knew a name that you guys probably know, Rodmacher. Earl Rodmacher was the president at Western Seminary at one time. Gary Rodmacher was his nephew. He was here. He said, hey, can you come talk to our elders? And so when I came, they explained the situation, and they were ready to hire someone else. And I said, please don't. You'll just end up destroying that guy's life, and then whatever else comes next. I said, we need to figure out who you are and who you want to really be. And so I spent about a year and a half getting them to a place where they were willing to acknowledge their own sin and also figure out who they were. And I knew Ryan a little bit, don't remember a lot of the details except the elbows we threw each other playing basketball at Multnomah. And so when I came, my heart's desire was more than anything to contact these pastors, which I did, and ask them to depart differently, to write a letter or to come to the church. and let's have a conversation so we can bring some healing.
This is the Bass pastors?
This was each and every one of the guys.
Wow.
There were 3 pastors from 3 different SCC experiences, and Bass was one of them. And, Ryan really was the only guy, after much twisting of the arm and beating up, that took me up on it, actually. And that's an interesting story in itself, which we'll get into. But the other guys didn't want anything part of it. The beautiful thing is the first guy now comes to our church, the first pastor who left. And then secondly, both Ryan and I have had conversations with the second pastor, who actually started Vast. And then the third one, he's gone and, really doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So it was a time period of trying to bring healing to the existing church that ultimately led to having more conversations with Ryan, which I think more were the result not only of a little bit of knowing each other, but a lot because of COVID. So COVID was God's instrument to help us come together in a way that was more healthy, that created the kind of humility that was necessary.
Wow. So now, and then just the last piece of like historical context, and then Gabe will take us into the present day. How big is this community? For people that aren't familiar with Sisters Oregon, like, it sounds like a lot of church splits and conflict for maybe not that large of a Christian community. What are we talking about here?
Yeah. Right.
Sisters proper is a town of 3,200 people. So the amount of people you can argue with 3,000 people, I think we've had about that many conflicts. School district's about 15,000. So, and just kind of put it in context for folks listening, basically what happened in 2011, 2012, when the church split, historically, what I remember, it was about a third. A third of the people stayed. A third of the people went with Vast. And a third of the people said, if this is what church is, I don't want anything to do with it. We're done. And so out of that third that came to Vast, I would say about half to 65% of them left once the pastor resigned after starting it. So it was a really, if I could just kind of describe for our listeners, the culture was one of incredible emotional, relational, and spiritual pain, confusion, suspicion, anti-authority. If this is what leadership is and what it does, I'm not trusting anyone. And that's where Satan wants us, right? Don't trust anyone, only trust yourself. And so this was the state of the union, and so it was about 6 months. We just did interim things at Vast. I helped out a little bit. Different people spoke and preached, and we actually just went through the book of Acts. We just admitted as a group of people, we don't understand what the church is. We need to learn. Let's go study the best thing we can study on the church, the book of Acts. And we went through that for about 1.5 years. And then I became the interim pastor at the church. And that was a great season, because interim pastor, I have to say, and I've been thinking about this more, we need a working theology of interim pastor ministry, itinerant preacher kind. We need a more robust theology of it, because there's something very profoundly psychologically and socially true. When you don't think you're going to be around in 6 months, you're not leveraging your relationships and trying to make everything safe and padded. The best imagery I can use is, have you ever seen the show Restaurant Impossible? A guy goes in, failing restaurant. He's a big buff guy. And he just starts giving everyone the business. You're fired. Your attitude sucks. I hate your cooking. He fires everybody. And the beautiful thing is, he knows, I'm not going to be around in a week when all the relational fallout happens. And so that was my season when I went on staff at the church. I didn't think I was going to be around very long. I thought 6 months to 12 months. And God really used that to bring some healing to our church where there needed to be some unavoidable conflicts and some unavoidable hard conversations and some really bad attitudes that needed to be confronted and corrected. If I would have thought I need to be here the next 10 years, so I better be careful, I don't know if I would have done it the same way I did. So I think that's just something I've been thinking about, in my story, but also when Steve came to SCC, it was a short-term stop for him. And so he had the same kind of internal freedom. And I think the Lord really used that in both churches with that interim piece. So that's an interesting observation.
Yeah. The other interesting thing was when VAST and SCC split, the demographics were very different. Not that they didn't have a little bit of either, but the church that I came to, the average age was probably 60 or over. And probably for Ryan, a little bit more of a mix, but all of the young families tended to go in that direction. So it was very hard to build with a church that was old. Younger families might come for a short while, but there wasn't a whole lot for their kids, even though we had this 10-acre campus and school and playground and all of this stuff. And Ryan, on the other hand, was in a place where, they're having to rent spaces or be at the school. And that's why I said when COVID came, there was no school anymore. And it was our opportunity as a church, SEC, to say, hey, we want to be a blessing to you. Why don't you just use our campus? Come Saturday nights. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but it created a space that allowed for us to figure out, can we really love each other?
I want to press into that just a little bit. And by the way, just an observation, Steve and Ryan, both of you, we can hear your heart for leadership health. And I love it. I mean, it's very noticeable for both of you. And I know that has come out of hardship, really, but because it has come out of hardship, it's a conviction for you both. And you really come off strong on that. I hope we all pick that up a little bit, and rub off on me a little bit, rub off on us a little bit, because it's so important. And I know it's a big reason why this story is the story. So back to that, it sounds like COVID was a real instrumental time, but zooming into today, these churches have merged. Sisters and Vast are one church, right? So walk us through that process. What was that like? How did that happen?
Well, I'd say one of the benefits of having, and both for Ryan and I, having been around the Northwest long enough, we just started relationally sharing one another's pulpit. So I would speak at VAST, Ryan would speak at SCC. And as we continued down the road of thinking about how do we really come together? Because I think both of us felt there's a much better story in coming together than there is in splitting apart. Mm-hmm. And I think we both believe that the heart of the gospel is a reconciliatory one. It's God pursuing Adam. It's the Father pursuing the prodigal. It's God going after Abraham. And I mean, for me, in my life, in my experience, even as a believer, in my life of experience before that, reconciliation is at the heart of what I want in my life. And so I think we started having those conversations and sharing and getting comfortable with one another. And then we decided at that point to bring in somebody from the outside that we both trusted. And there was a fellow by the name of Kelly Freed who had been the student deans at Multnomah. And but I knew Kelly through a number of different venues. Kelly was a family therapist. Kelly worked with Love and Logic. Kelly was a principal of a school in Portland. And Kelly was really good at helping people come together. And so we invited him to come with all of our elders from both churches and begin to have the conversation. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I think I think in my 20s and 30s, well, I'm 44 almost. In my 20s, it was just arrogance. Everyone's wrong. I'll do it. Angry young prophet. At your 30s, you really have to come face to face with the pain of life. And you really got to come face to face with not just who you are, but who you're not. And you got to, so I think my personal development was right in the middle of this, where I was just coming face to face with who I really was and my deep fears and my deep insecurities. And really, God was pressing me to a spot of, am I going to seriously look at that? Am I going to lean into that? Or am I going to just keep trying to do it on my own, proving it? And if the gospel is the gospel, which means I have nothing to prove anymore. And if the gospel is the gospel, which means he's tearing down the wall of hostility for Jew and Gentile. I mean, like I'm preaching through the book of Ephesians and I'm preaching this stuff and I'm like, what are we doing? Like, so for me, I would say this is how we got here personally for me. It's not just an organizational moment in two churches' histories. It is very much a biographical moment in my own development into Christ dependence, into Christ likeness. I can't really divorce the two. They're just very intertwined for me. And so I think at the core of it, God was taking me to a place that I was either going to release control, and that had to do with humility, and that had to do with trusting God with outcomes and trusting God with pain. Sometimes I control things because I don't want to be in pain. And God was just taking me to a spot where I was either going to have to face these things and trust, or bury them, suppress them, and soldier on. And so at the biographical moment in my own development, that's where things were at for me. And kind of reluctantly and slowly, God really opened my heart to trust. Mainly him, but also Steve a little bit.
I think what Ryan is saying is the key to all of our lives, because, I'm 74, so I'm 30 years older than Ryan. And I had my moment at 40 when my humility was enforced upon me, because I thought I was in control. And the more you try to control, the more out of control you can become. And that's where the enemy sneaks in and you find yourself doing really stupid stuff. So I find that, for both of us in this stage of life, for different reasons, vulnerability and humility was the key to freedom. And that freedom led to allowing God to work both in our hearts and in our churches, sometimes having to say hard things and sometimes having to step back and let grace have its way in both of our lives and in the lives of our churches, which led to, this merge as well. And I think one of the most beautiful parts of that story is that the community saw it. So it wasn't just these two churches coming together. It was a whole bunch of other people since then coming to the church, because in a time of division and partisan politics and COVID arguments, God brought these two churches together and people said, I want to know what that's about. And so we saw our church not just double by two churches coming together. We've seen our church triple and even more because of the story of what God was doing.
That's amazing. I mean, I think that's to me, that's the striking part of, one of the striking things about this story is the outcome intention was about transformation of character. It seems like, I mean, I'm just seeing that so deep in everything you guys are saying. So I think that's remarkable, because if you had said at the outset, ooh, we have a plan let's merge our two churches so that the net becomes even more people than two bodies. It wouldn't have worked because the outcome would have, you would have been tempted for all those things you were just talking about. But I love that the outcome was rooted in more health and more personal transformation, discipleship, growth. I want to touch on that in just a minute, but just to clarify, when did these two churches officially become one church?
Yeah, it was May 2022. So in January of 2022, we had a 3-day get all the elders together, lots of prayer. We wrote down what we identified were 7 rocks. And anytime you got to move rocks in a pack, you got to put the big ones in first. So we said, what's the biggest rock? And we, okay, that's awkward. That's going to be a hard conversation. We're going to talk about that first. And we worked through these things through the word, prayer, the spirit, humility. And I left that time in January 2022. And I think this, Gabe, illustrates your point a little bit. I wasn't interested in a pragmatic arrangement, no more than I would be interested in, well, I should marry this person because it would, she could cook and clean or whatever, I didn't need a pragmatic change in my life. I needed relational presence. I needed embodiment, gospel embodiment. I needed leaders that could, shoulder this with me, but also invest in me and learn from. And I didn't want to be the oldest guy in the room. I wanted to be with some gray hairs.
You're getting them, Ryan. I've known you for a good decade, man.
Yeah, there's some silver fox. That's all good. So when we left that time in January, I knew in my heart, that's when I was convinced in my heart that the preferable path forward for the future, it just wasn't like, well, this would make more sense on paper. No, I mean deeper than that. I mean the desire of my heart, the preferred path forward was together. And the reason I knew that is because these men I was with the elders at SCC, they actually cared about me. They were checking in on my spiritual health. They were asking me hard questions. There was a sense of accountability there. There was a sense of safety in that accountability. There was a sense of strength, but there was also a sense of tenderness and humility. And so it wasn't pragmatic for me at all. It was relational primarily.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I want to let's drill on 2 things, and then I'm gonna hand it back to Ahshuwah. One thing, if the church had a dashboard, and all churches had a dashboard, and there were the lights, low on oil or check whatever, what would you say would be the things that would stand out to go, ooh, a church split might be on your radar? What kinds of things are the warnings or the telltale signs that there's unhealth that tends to lead to things like that? You guys, I'm sure, have processed a lot of this kind of stuff.
I think part of that is being in touch with the church, and I mean the individuals in the church. We learn a lot more in life groups or small groups or however you might call them, or you learn a lot more over coffee or over dinners. And as we all know, sometimes the leadership is sitting in the pew, not up behind the pulpit, and you have to have your pulse on those things. And sometimes those are the things that are the hard conversations. I remember having them with a particular individual one time, and I said, we're going to be coming together, having a meeting, having conversations. And I just want you to know ahead of time that if you get up and do what you did at the last time, I will call you out and ask you to leave. Because if you don't, not in an unkind way, not in a bullying way, but in a way that says, we're not doing that anymore. We're not doing it that way anymore. Because when I watched that video that I mentioned and having been around, a lot of times when those moments happen, nobody steps up and says, stop it. this isn't just unhealthy for you. This is unhealthy for everybody. And so I think we had some of those hard conversations on the SCC side, because that's who I was addressing. And then I think we did a really good job, sitting up together and talking to the congregation together, Ryan and I, and even at one time, all the elders, and letting them ask questions and, what are we doing? What are we talking about? And I think clarity is something that is absolutely necessary in any endeavor where you're moving forward. Ryan used the metaphor of marriage. And if you don't have some good conversations up front, every day is like Halloween. People wear their masks and they come and they pretend. And then you end up finding out that they're not really who they are. Mm-hmm. So I think we did a really good job doing that out of a position of unification from a leadership perspective.
Yeah. It almost sounds like you're saying disunity would be one kind of like ding, 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 watch out, or lack of clarity, maybe. Anything else? Ryan, can you think of something that you were like looking back?
Totally. I think this is going to be paradoxical, but when there's no conflict, be careful. If you look at the 5 dysfunctions of a team, trust is at the bottom. And if there's not trust, there's avoidance of conflict. So just had a friend call me. He was telling me about this church that he's on staff with, and they want him to take the next lead pastor position. So I started asking some questions. And at the end of the day, it's a church built on flattery, not reality. We can't talk about what's not going well. We can't talk about how pastors failing here. We can't talk about how the church is not doing. And my question to him is, are you interested in a church that's built on artificial harmony? Because that's what it'll produce. So I actually want to see healthy conflicts. I want to see people disagreeing. I want to see ideas batted around. I even want to see passion on that and passionate disagreement. But I also want to see the maturity that says, man, even though we disagree, this is what we decided, we're going together. And I think I think the world that we were trained in our seminaries, they did the best they could, but they did not prepare us for the emotional and relational complexities that we live in. Such a quick, the rapid reaction, the rapid response, everything's instant feedback, everything, that kind of intake constantly as a leader, we're not prepared for that. And so what we end up doing is we sequester ourselves and we isolate, and then we create a culture that doesn't invite feedback. And so if a church isn't talking honestly about assessing how they're doing and talking about what's going well, what's not, and there's not a freedom to talk about that, that's a problem, because something's bubbling under the surface.
That's right. And probably we'd all agree, seminaries don't have time to train you, teach you that stuff.
No way.
They don't have enough time to even teach you how to teach or preach. Sometimes, I remember being in Greece one time, and the fella who was the pastor of the church was elderly fella, and he said to me, "You can't speak here." And I said, "How come?" He says, "You don't have any gray hair." and so there's something about that speaks to what Ryan is talking about. All of us need to grow up emotionally, and there are some things in life that you just can't. It's not about information. It's not about doctrine. It's about life and vulnerability and humility and pain. And nobody wants to get there that way, but we're all stumbling through the cross if we're willing to pick it up.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so cross is a great metaphor for sacrifice, which is something it sounds like you guys have been willing to really put into this relationship, because it's been a long journey and there's been a lot of things. Tell us about one sacrifice that you think has been really necessary, and what was the motivational value behind it that kept you going toward that during the dry time or the hard time?
Yeah.
Right. One quick one was that because our congregation was a little older. I mean, I was preaching every Sunday. Ryan was preaching mostly every Sunday. Ryan did a much better job at building a leadership team than I did because I didn't have anybody else to build a team with. And because the congregation was older, one of the things, and Ryan was incredibly good at this, I said, I probably have to speak a little bit more than you do up front because the older people need a little bit more of an adjustment. And we did that really well the first year, where, maybe it was 3 and 2 or whatever that looked like. And now we're able to sort of transfer that to a different, way to do it. And I'm kind of like, I said to Ryan, I don't want to pastor a big church. I don't even come here to pastor, but Ryan's doing, and he's good at it. He's strategizing. He's, really functioning and watching over the staff and pastoring the staff. And my heart has always been more entrepreneurial and evangelistic. So I get to do outside in the community doing stuff. So it's really, unbeknownst to us, a perfect marriage in that sense. And so both of us are having fun. I think I am. I'll let Ryan speak for himself.
Yeah, I'm having fun. I would say the sacrifices are more perceived sacrifices. I think what we do is especially us young guys, and I'm middle-aged now, so the young guys out there, they find a brand or they find an icon or a voice, and whatever that brand or icon of evangelicalism elevates peripherally, it becomes too important. So I think it was Lewis who said, any vice wrongly or any virtue wrongly elevated can become a vice. And I think the perceived sacrifice is I have to give up some of these peripheral things. And what I found is actually they were all worth giving up, because if Jesus is correct, and I think he is, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And of course, Francis Schaeffer makes the great observation that the Lord Jesus, by his own confession and his own teaching, has given the world a subjective observational power to determine whether or not the gospel is real. And he's entrusted that to the world. It's like, wow, that's pretty powerful. But I'm going to have to give up this little, peripheral thing that we really like, or this style, or the website, or whatever the thing is. And what I found is all of the things that have been perceived that I've given up, God has given me exponentially more. I love not having to do everything. I love having a team. I love that I can miss a weekend to be with my children. I love that I can bounce ideas off Steve. I love that I've got an elder team I'm working with. So I would say any of the sacrifices were only perceptive. They haven't really been actual sacrifices.
Yeah.
So good.
They've led to freedom.
Absolutely.
In a good way.
Yeah. And I can speak as someone that my family, at least once or twice a year, goes out and stays at a missionary retreat out near Sisters, and we'll be able to visit your church a couple times and teach perspectives there. It's a joy. I mean, to walk into this worshiping gathering, a standing room only, packed house, and recognize that like people are meeting Jesus in this small town. I think it's actually a meaningful percentage of the community that's a part of your church. And it's the fruit there is evidence, and the passion, the love for Jesus, the passion for global missions, that I've observed in your people has been really, and deeply encouraging. Let's land the plane on this. And this is more on the practical, maybe, takeaway application side. So your story reminds me almost on the opposite of one of the most discouraging stories that I've heard from a church planter. And it was this. I was talking to him, and he had already left the ministry and was doing some just vocational job. But he said that he was a church planter that parachuted into Portland, and he was struggling, and he was trying to plant this church and get his core team off the ground. And he had met a number of other church planters that were going through the same things. They were struggling, young bucks, right, with their vision to plant a church, just like you're describing, Ryan. And he said he got these guys together and said, hey, we're all in a similar place. We're all struggling to pay the bills, to grow our core team. What if we all just merged? What if we like combined our church plants together and we could be like one actually like sustainable church and find a way to do that? And he's telling me this story and he's like brokenhearted over it because he said, you know what? None of them were open to doing it. And it's like 5 years later and all the churches have closed. None of the church planters continued.
Wow.
And it's like, what could have been, right? Yeah. If these dudes kind of set aside some of their pride and their own, personal vision and left some of those things out to create something new together. So what word of wisdom, would you have either, and maybe either side of a dude that's struggling with those pride issues related to a church split, either like, he's the dude that's like, I'm going to take a crew with me because I got a better plan than these people that are here, or the person that's dealing on the inside with someone doing that, or the young guy that's trying to start his vision, but maybe has an opportunity to merge, or maybe has an opportunity to give up some of that control, either of a building maybe that they're giving up, or like sharing a pulpit. Like, what would you say to those guys dealing with either an opportunity or a serious like danger situation related to needing to learn to share leadership and vision?
Yeah, I would say a few things. The first one, I would, for those that are feeling stuck, I want to give a little bit of empathy before I give a hard word. So the empathy is, I'm sorry, it's hard, you're right. And then the hard word is Psalm 139, to really invite God to search. The problem is we assume that the Lord is fully supportive of all of our plans, and we assume that our motivations for our plans are pure. And I think to get before the Lord and say, God, search me and know me, go wherever you want to go. Reveal whatever you want to reveal. And see, I think the Lord is much more interested in that than, the cool branded church with the young pastor and that kind of thing. The second thing is much more practical. I'm really thankful for Steve and just for the way he's paved the way for me to be. I just feel like whether they came from Vast or they're part of SCC, I just feel like I'm, pastoring these people. To me, there's no distinction. That's never been in our DNA here. So I would just say to the older churches, I just looked before this podcast started, 4,500 churches are closing a year, and probably half of those have assets in a building. Let's stop church planting. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say church planting. It says that the gospel was growing. The word of God was multiplying. Let's multiply gospel works, and then let's find places where we can house those. Let's find organizational structures to house those things. Let's stop church planting. Let's plant the gospel. And then you older pastors that have the really nice children's wing where a kid hasn't been since 1987, and you have Huggies that you need to throw away because they're so old, let's give it away. That's what Steve did with us. Hey, we got a children's wing not being used. Let's give it away. Let's give it away. And when a congregation comes with generosity, with kindness, you know what I never felt from Steve? I never felt like he was trying to control me. This man just wanted to love me. He wanted to care about me. He wanted to help me. Stop trying to control everything. Just go serve. You're blessed. The blessing you have, go and give it away. And so I think when young men and young church planters and some of these idealists start getting cared for and loved, because they're operating out of a persona, they're operating out of a wound, they're operating out of an orphan spirit. When they're loved well by mentors and older men, beautiful things happen. And that's all I'm going to say. Steve, go.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ryan, that you said that, and appreciate that. I would say God doesn't need you, and I think for all of us, and for me, in those early days, because I was 27 when I planted our first church, you want to control everything. And matter of fact, the worst thing possible is if you in life have been successful at controlling everything, you continue in ministry. I mean, before I became a believer, I was really good at controlling everything. until I wasn't. And I think you need people in your life. I think one of the beauty of sharing ministry with Ryan, and now we have another guy, Mark, is that you don't have to control everything. You don't even have to do everything. And it's such a blessing. Inherently, we talk about being made in the image of God, being relational. And yet we stand alone doing everything and thinking that we're really needed. And so it's been a beautiful thing. And I think find people that, even people in your congregation, older, wiser, that maybe can speak into your life. I think one of the benefits that we have at SCC is we have both young and older leaders. Our elder team is an amazing bunch of guys who have been very successful in life, some of them in ministry. And if there's some humility on our part, we can learn from that. And I think being open to that, because honestly, if there's not voluntary humility, there's going to be enforced humility. And when God brings it into your life, it's much more painful.
Wow. Thank you, brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. Thanks so much for sharing.
Well, thank you guys for letting us do this. This has been somewhat cathartic for us as well, because, we're still in the middle of it and still trying to figure out. And, we have now problems that are good problems, like we've outgrown our facility, but we need to make sure that we're not getting caught up with that we still do the work of the ministry.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you'd want to share with our audience, ways that they can find you guys, other resources that you would recommend to church leaders?
If any of this has been helpful, or if you're like, hey, I want to talk more, just personally reach out to either of us, sisterschurch.com. We don't have social media. We don't know how to work that stuff. But just find our email on the website, and we would, both Steve and I, we would just be overjoyed to give whatever we got, serve however we can. And just for any pastors listening that are really deeply struggling, we've all been there. So stay at it, stay faithful. That's what matters.
I just say amen to that.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com, where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.